China's Lunar New Year is here. Let us enjoy some fireworks before hitting today's topic. Happy Chinese New Year to all Chinese baddies, regardless the skin color and ethnicity. The People's Republic of China is turning 77 years old soon, and the modern China, starting with the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, is over 110 years old. Whether on the Chinese mainland in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Macau, or in overseas Chinese communities, Chinese people are leading a much better life than ever before. Today's prosperity is not from nowhere. For nearly 200 years, generation after generation, hundreds of thousands of Chinese heroes have moved toward a common goal, returning to the center of the world arena. China's name in Mandarin means the country in the center of the world, which was true for thousands of years before the century of humiliation, roughly from 1839 to 1949, from the First Opium War to the founding of the PRC. China was dethroned from the pinnacle of the world by the British, the French, and other Western powers, and today the United States is employing all means to prevent it from regaining its historical glory. Many call China a superpower, but it has not yet become a unified country. Taiwan is not back, and the US is the leading factor preventing it from joining Greater China over the past 8 decades. Nowadays, the great competition between China and the United States determines the direction of the world. Thus, we're stepping back nearly 2 centuries to unpack a theme that still shapes one of the most consequential relationships in global politics, that between the United States and China. To understand where China is today, strategically, emotionally, and politically, we have to understand where it was. And the period from around 1839 to 1949 was deeply traumatic, a period historians call the century of humiliation. That is a story of military defeat, unequal treaties, foreign domination, national awakening, and ultimately, a powerful motivation for rejuvenation and global status. Before the First Opium War, China wasn't weak by the standards of global empires. The Qing dynasty had ruled since the mid-1600s and controlled a huge, diverse territory. It had advanced agriculture, sophisticated governance structures, and one of the world's most productive economies. But by the early 19th century, cracks were showing. China's economy was growing more slowly than the industrializing West. Technological innovations were uneven. Internal unrest, like the White Lotus Rebellion, strained the state. The Qing court held long-established beliefs about China's place in the world, often underestimating the force of foreign powers. So when Western imperial ambitions collided with China's system, shockwaves followed. The First Opium War started the trauma that has haunted China till today. The spark was Britain's trade problem with China, a little like today's trade war between China and the United States. Westerners wanted silk, tea, and porcelain, but China mostly wanted silver. Britain's solution to the imbalance is brutal. They grew opium in India and sold it to China. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted, draining silver out of the country. When Chinese officials, including Lin Zexu, cracked down on opium imports, Britain took it as a reason to go to war. The British crushed Qing forces, blockaded ports, and forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the first of many unequal treaties. The war's outcomes were profound and continue to affect today's China. Britain gained Hong Kong permanently as a British territory, but 155 years later, China reclaimed it, along with the leased lands. China had to pay huge indemnities. 5 treaty ports opened to Western merchants. Foreign powers effectively overrode Chinese laws, and Chinese officials could not punish foreigners who committed crimes on China's soil. That wasn't a fair deal. It was imposed after a military defeat. And that became the template: military loss to force concessions to foreign privileges on Chinese soil. France joined Britain in the Second Opium War. After another brutal war, China had to accept more treaty ports, the legalization of the opium trade, foreign envoys in Beijing, and Christian missionary activity. And Beijing's old summer palace, Yuanming Yuan, was looted and destroyed, an emotional scar that resonates in Chinese collective memory to this day. After the Opium Wars came a cascade of humiliations. The Treaty of Tianjin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, opened additional ports and ceded greater legal authority to foreign powers. Russia forced the Treaty of Agen, 1858, and the Treaty of Beijing, 1860, gaining vast land in the north. France seized control of Vietnam and later forced China to cede territory. Germany, Italy, and other Western powers carved out spheres of influence, zones where they controlled customs, infrastructure, and trade rights. The United States and Japan extracted similar concessions, often under most favored nation clauses. Each of these treaties weakened Chinese sovereignty while empowering foreign powers on Chinese soil. Collectively, they became symbols of national betrayal and loss. The humiliation wasn't only external. China also grappled with major internal revolts. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, was perhaps the deadliest civil conflict in human history, with tens of millions of deaths and more displacements. The Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, was an anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising that ended with foreign armies occupying Beijing. Both underscored how vulnerable China was. Politically fragmented, militarily outgunned, and unable to defend its own people or territory. In the wake of these upheavals, China's authority shrank. Foreign powers carved out more privileges. Chinese leaders realized the Qing dynasty was ineffective. Reformers and revolutionaries gained credibility. That leads us to one of the most consequential shifts in modern Chinese history. The Qing dynasty fell. China became a republic in theory, but in practice it splintered. Regional warlords controlled vast territories. Foreign powers still enjoyed privileges. Many Chinese territories were under de facto foreign authority. To revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen, the humiliation wasn't just foreign, it was domestic. The old system had failed, and a new direction was necessary. Then came the May 4 movement in 1919, sparked by the outcome of World War I, in which Western powers handed Chinese territories once controlled by Germany to Japan. It was an intellectual and cultural turning point. It questioned tradition and embraced modern political ideas, including nationalism, socialism, and modernization. That laid the groundwork for the two major parties that would shape modern China. Chinese Communist Party, the CPC, and Kuomintang, the KMT, or nationalists. Both agreed on one thing: China needed to be strong and free from foreign domination, despite their internal fights and quarrels. Then the Great Depression hit the world, and two evil countries, Germany and Japan, began to conquer Europe and China, respectively. The Second Sino-Japanese War was a brutal chapter. Japan invaded and held large portions of China for years. Major atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre became defining memories of suffering. After Japan's defeat in 1945, China was devastated, millions dead, economies collapsed, and social structures in ruins. Soon after, the CPC defeated the nationalists in civil war, and in 1949, the People's Republic of China, PRC, was born. Historians say China's century of humiliation was over, and the Chinese stood up. So what do we mean by century of humiliation? It's less a precise academic term and more a national narrative. It marks the period from the First Opium War, 1839, to the establishment of the PRC, 1949. It highlights foreign domination, unequal treaties, loss of sovereignty, and internal decay. And it portrays China as once powerful, then humiliated, and now determined never to be weak again. This narrative became especially influential in the mid-20th century, and even more so after China began reforming and opening up in the 1980s. It's invoked not merely as history, but as a moral and political touchstone, a reminder of what China must not allow to happen again. In China today, this history is a core part of school curriculums. Children learn the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, foreign interventions, and the century of humiliation as part of national history. Documentaries, movies, and even museum exhibits often portray this period as one of exploitation and national suffering. Instead of viewing China only as a historic empire, many Chinese see themselves as a nation reborn, rising from the ashes of humiliation to reclaim dignity and influence. Unlike debates in some Western historiographies about nuance or context, in China, this period is usually taught as a clear story of injustice and recovery that shapes emotional responses to foreign powers and global politics. You don't have to be a historian to grasp how powerful that is. It's not just knowing what happened. It's knowing why it matters today. When the PRC was founded in 1949, foreign policy was initially driven more by Cold War alignments than by the direct legacy of the century of humiliation. But once China began opening its economy in the late 1970s and 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, the emphasis shifted to restoring China's place in the world. No foreign power should again dictate China's affairs. That is why China is often sensitive about any foreign criticism of its internal policies. Issues such as Taiwan, the South China Sea, and border disputes are framed in the language of resisting foreign interference and defending unity. Territories lost or contested during the century of humiliation are especially symbolic. China doesn't just want to be strong, it wants to be respected. Many Chinese leaders see respect as a counter to past humiliations. Here's where we see the psychological and political link between past and present. China's leaders have framed the country's rise in three broad stages. The century of humiliation, 1839 to 1949, was a period of weakness and exploitation. It laid the groundwork for modern China. Recovery and reunification, 1949 to the late 20th century, was an important period for China's unification. China recovered Hong Kong and Macau in 1997 and 1999, respectively, but Taiwan is still a breakaway province. Hopefully, the mainland and Taiwan can be reunited by 2030 or earlier. National rejuvenation is the ultimate goal for China to reclaim its historical prominence in the 21st century, not just regionally but globally. This national rejuvenation is a slogan we hear repeatedly in Chinese media and official presentations. It draws a straight line from past humiliation to future greatness. China's rejuvenation will undermine America's global hegemony, which is why the United States is employing all means to stop China's rise across almost all fronts. Now let's connect history to the present, specifically, how this narrative shapes China's approach to the United States. Because of the long period of foreign intrusion, there's an ingrained concern that powerful countries can intervene in Chinese affairs for their own benefit. That makes Chinese leaders cautious about U.S. advocacy on the so-called human rights, democracy, or strategic alliances in Asia. Moreover, U.S. criticism of China's internal policies strikes a nerve not just politically but historically. To Chinese leaders, it can feel like a reminder of past foreign meddling. China doesn't want to be equal to the U.S. In the Chinese official language, it wants great power relations, a relationship where China is respected as a global leader whose interests matter. This framing influences negotiations on trade, the military presence in Asia, and engagement with global institutions such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. China doesn't see the world in purely hostile terms, but it does want to ensure it's not constrained by external systems developed without its leadership. That plays out in areas like technology policy, supply chains, and security alliances. Let's break down how that historical narrative translates into strategic behavior today. Militarily, China invests heavily in defense, not just to deter rivals, but to ensure no foreign power can easily impose its will again. Military modernization is often framed as a means of protecting sovereignty and national security. It does not want to become prey again. Economically, the trauma of exploitation in the 19th century has fueled a desire for economic strength and technological self-reliance, which is why initiatives such as Made in China 2025 and supply chain diversification are emphasized. Diplomatically, China is getting more assertive under Xi Jinping's leadership than under previous leaders. China engages in global governance and regional initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), expanding infrastructure investment globally, and participates in climate talks, peacekeeping, and development financing. That isn't just economic and diplomatic, it's also symbolic. China is helping shape the future, not just reacting to it. Still, the PRC sticks to its non-interference principle. It often rejects what it calls interference in internal affairs. This principle stems partly from the desire to prevent the kind of foreign meddling that happened in the past. China promotes its own version of history and culture abroad through Confucius institutes, media, and cultural diplomacy. That isn't about erasing history, it's about balancing global narratives with China's perspective. When trade disputes happen, China often frames its stance in terms of equal treatment, fair competition, and sovereign decision-making. Though economics dominate here, the historical lens is always nearby. China wants to be treated as a global leader, not contained or forced into disadvantageous positions. To many Chinese leaders, Taiwan isn't just a political question, it's a symbolic continuation of unhealed historical wounds related to territorial dismemberment. Pressure from outside powers on this issue is seen through a highly sensitive lens. Territorial assertions in the South China Sea are framed as a means of protecting China's sovereign rights. Foreign naval presence in the region is often described in terms that echo past intrusions. When Western governments criticize China's internal policies, Beijing often pushes back by pointing to Western colonial histories or human rights issues domestically in Western countries. That isn't purely deflection, historical memory informs how such criticism is perceived. Why history matters so deeply for the Chinese people, then? Here's the core: history isn't just about the past in China, it's a lens through which the present and future are understood. For many Chinese citizens, the century of humiliation isn't a dusty chapter of textbooks. It's a common theme that critics of weakness use to inspire reformers, revolutionaries, and leaders. It's a reason that China prioritizes sovereignty, dignity, and global respect. And because this narrative is taught broadly in schools, reinforced culturally, and echoed in political speeches, it doesn't stay in elites' minds, it becomes a collective identity. Most ordinary Chinese people know key episodes such as the Opium Wars and the Japanese invasion, viewing China's rise as a return to its rightful place in the world. Most of them, even if they are not Communist Party members, see Western criticism as sometimes disrespectful of China's sovereignty and dignity. And the society has reached a consensus that national strength is a safeguard against foreign pressure, so whenever a Chinese aircraft carrier is commissioned, there are applauses across the country. It also affects public opinion in subtle and overt ways, for instance, enthusiasm for technological achievement, support for a strong military, and growing distrust of foreign media narratives about China. These feelings aren't just political, they're cultural and emotional. Finally, let's connect all this back to what it means for global politics today and tomorrow, particularly between China and the United States, which are interconnected economically, environmentally, and culturally. Cooperation is essential on issues like climate change and global health, and these two powers have fundamentally different worldviews shaped by different histories. For the US, China's growth raises questions about power balancing, trade rules, and security alliances. For China, its history is a reminder of the catastrophic consequences of weakness and disunity. A big challenge in US-China relations is that each side sometimes sees the other through the lens of its own anxieties. The US worries about Beijing's growing strategic competition and influence. China worries about being contained or disrespected by the US and its allies. Each side's historical narratives fuel these anxieties. Understanding that the memory of humiliation deeply shapes China's approach doesn't mean agreeing with all its policies, but it does mean seeing the emotional and historical logic behind them. At least, people will understand why China's diplomats are behaving like wolf warriors. That's critical for diplomacy that isn't stuck in zero-sum thinking. Although history doesn't determine destiny, it frames how people understand choices. China's leaders and citizens draw from the narrative of the past to make sense of present challenges. For the US and the world, engaging with that narrative thoughtfully, rather than dismissively, makes it easier to navigate disagreements and build cooperation where possible. From the Opium Wars and unequal treaties, to the rise of modern China, to how historical memory shapes policy and identity today. That century of humiliation isn't a relic. It's a living force in China's national psyche and in its global strategy. History did not die, it is still alive, and it is the most important thing Westerners should understand when dealing with Chinese affairs.